Welcome participants to this MOOC course on climate change vulnerability and adaptation. I am Shahab Fazal, faculty in the Department of Geography at Aligarh Muslim University. So now it's established that climate change is real and its impacts are widespread. There is already an urgent threat to millions of lives. But are there any solutions? Any way out from the severe crisis? The main challenge is to limit, restrict the greenhouse gas emissions. Human activities require energy to run their machines. The modern human being, they want to boost their economy. And for all that, we need to explore how we can get clean energy, because fossil fuel based energy is the main cause of this emission, which is resulting into global warming and the larger climate change. There is also possibility of reducing the carbon in the atmosphere by limiting the deforestation, which would eventually absorb carbon dioxide, making atmosphere cleaner. So we all now know that there are challenges, but also there are possible solutions to this phenomena of climate change. So here now in this lecture, I intend to explain the concept of net zero, which is actually being debated a lot in the context of climate change. Just to build my argument, I would say the main ways to stop climate change are to restrict the use of fossil fuels. There is no doubt about it. Fossil fuels include coal, oil, gas, and the more that we are extracting and burning, the worse climate change will get. The more we will burn, the more the phenomena of climate change would be pronounced over the Earth's surface. So all countries need to move their economies away from these fossil fuels as soon as possible. We need to invest more in renewable energy, changing our main energy sources to clean and renewable energy. And this is the best way to stop using fossil fuels. These includes technologies like solar, wind, wave, tidal, and even geothermal power. We need to switch to sustainable transport. Petrol and diesel vehicles, planes, ships, they use fossil fuels. Reduction in their use, switching to electric vehicles will help us to stop this phenomena. It will reduce the air pollution also. We also need to restore the nature, which would enable us to absorb more carbon. The natural world is very good at cleaning up our emissions, but we need to look after it. Planting trees in the right places or giving land back to the nature through rewilding schemes. This is because photosynthesizing plants draw down carbon dioxide as they grow and locking it away in the soils. We urgently need to protect forest because they are crucial in the fight against climate change. They help us in protecting us from the vagaries of climate change. So we need to protect them because it is an important climate solution. We all are observing that the cutting down of forest on an industrial scale, destroying giant trees, which actually suck up huge amounts of carbon. There are many countries, societies where forests are being cut down for animal farming, agricultural activity, etc. Even in India, this has happened in the past. We also need to protect the oceans because oceans are large carbon sinks. They absorb large amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which helps us to keep our climate stable. So there are some measures to reduce impact of climate change. The bottom line is to reduce the emissions. And in that context, net zero is an important term for our discussion on climate change. Net zero, what is it? Why does this word comes up and debated so much every time climate change discussion comes up? Is it science or is it politics? It may be linked to technology. If I can simplify, I would say it's a simple scientific concept, though it really gets talked about like that. Let me try and make an attempt to simplify it and explain it to you. Now you imagine a scale. On one side, we have the greenhouse gases, which we release by our activities. And on the other side, we have greenhouse gases, which the nature absorbs through carbon sinks. So now we have to balance the amount of greenhouse gases which we are releasing into the atmosphere and the amount which we are removing from the atmosphere, reducing the emissions and absorbing it through carbon sinks. The scale has to stay balanced so that too much gases don't cause the global warming, which we have discussed at length earlier. Now, scientists have studied that they have studied this net zero issue. They have raised this net zero issues and set a limit for how much the earth can warm without causing severe problems. And that limit they have identified and set as 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we have to keep earth below this temperature always, all the time, below this temperature. So with respect to net zero, I would say that now the reason for rise in temperature is global emissions. And scientists have found that we can release around 260 gigatons of carbon dioxide. If we want to control global warming, so we should not go beyond the 260 gigatons of carbon dioxide. But here's the situation. Currently, the world is emitting around 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. So if we take it from today, if we continue at this same rate, we are going to use all of them in very small duration. All our carbon budget would be exhausted in around 6 years. And we would touch the 1.5 degree centigrade warming of the atmosphere. And which means that beyond the 1.5 degree centigrade atmosphere temperature, it will become critical. Yes, it is critical. So the idea of net zero emission is often confused with stabilization of greenhouse gases concentrations in the atmosphere. This is because the carbon cycle continuously absorbs a small percentage of cumulative historical human-caused carbon dioxide emissions through vegetation and through the oceans, the water bodies. They are the major carbon sinks over the Earth's surface. This happens even after carbon dioxide emissions are reduced to zero, which is not possible, but I am just giving you the idea of net zero. Now, if the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were kept constant, some carbon dioxide emission could continue, which is quite obvious. However, global average surface temperature would continue to increase for many centuries due to the gradual adjustment of deep ocean temperatures. If carbon dioxide emissions that result directly from human activities are reduced to net zero, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would decline. But this is not happening. The rate of emission is far exceeding than what the carbon sinks are absorbing. So this would be a rate just fast enough to compensate for this deep ocean adjustment. The result would be approximately constant global average surface temperature over decades or centuries. But this is not happening. We all know that the emission rates are high. I would say very high. Our carbon budget is under threat. So we are about to reach, or we might have already reached the 1.5 degree warmness of the atmosphere. So it's all the countries, each one of us over the Earth's surface should work to achieve the net zero. Now remember, we can do this by two ways. First, reduce the usage of fossil fuel like coal, oil, gas for energy, which relieves a lot of greenhouse gases. And this is the main cause of global warming in the recent time. Second, we can find ways to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. How it is possible? Yes, it is possible. One way of doing that is using nature's help. For example, planting forest that can absorb more carbon dioxide. And another way is new technology to capture carbon dioxide emissions and store them under the ground. Or the technology which have lesser emissions. This way, we can contribute to reduce the threat of global warming and climate change. So how the countries, especially the developed world, they are planning to achieve net zero. In that context, 2015 is very important. It is important in the sense that the Paris Climate Change Agreement was initiated in 2015, where many countries, including India, signed an agreement which was called as Paris Climate Change Agreement. Countries actually came up with their own targets for when they would want to achieve the net zero. That is, the balance their greenhouse gas emissions with the greenhouse gas restoration removed from the atmosphere. This includes United States of America, which is one of the largest gas emitter, and it has set the target for 2050. China and Russia, both of them, they are again leading emitters, have set a target for 2060. The oil-rich, leading oil-producing, exporting Saudi Arabia, it said that they will try to reach the net zero situation by 2060. India, in modern time, is said to be the fourth largest greenhouse gas emitter, has set a target of about for 2070, when we will have the balance between the emission and the absorption of carbon dioxide. We are calling it as net zero. India has set the target to 2070. So here a note. This net zero concept, it is a long-term pledges, but they are not legally binding. So net zero is not in that sense immediate climate action. And here's where a very important part of the net zero discourse comes into the play, where I would make the distinction between global north versus global south. There is concern about countries in the globe, the global south like India setting targets beyond 2050. The argument is that we simply don't have that kind of time. But remember, the first crucial part is that the burden of the bulk of the climate crisis actually falls on the global north. The Americans, the Europeans, Japan, Australia. Whereas many developing countries like India, they have basic needs which are yet to be met for a large population. The developing countries have large population with limited resources. Another thing to remember is that it requires a lot of money to change, to transform from existing power stations based on fossil fuels to the new renewable energy infrastructure, either by buying it or by building it. Because this is what the expensive carbon capture technology is. The third thing is developing countries are asking developed countries to support them financially because they have contributed less to the global warming. Now, all the developed countries are actually ready to do, but there are some issues which are very important and critical. The first one if I can point out is that of most of the developed countries, they are offering what are called as climate loans, which needs to be paid back. Another thing to remember that there are lots of things politicians have to think about, keeping the views of the scientist along with it. Because, for example, simply like planting a lot of trees at specific geographic locations are not very helpful for carbon restoration, because in some of the locations they require more water, which could be a problem for areas where water is scarce. So in that sense, I am saying that it's not, these policies implementation needs to have scientific justification also. So net zero is an important goal. There are challenges, and a big picture is that those least responsible bearing the most of the brunt, the developing countries, for essentially historical excesses that have been committed against them by the developed world. In that context, I would point out the recent developments. At the recent COP29 climate summit, there was divergent opinion over climate finance. Developing countries demanded $1.3 trillion annually up to 2030 to address the climate change. On the contrary, the global north only proposed $300 billion annually, and that too by up to 2035. So there is discrepancy, and this highlights the ongoing struggle for fair and adequate climate finance. So in the context of net zero, the division of view between global north and global south is very prominent. The simple argument is that the global north, they have achieved their development by emitting in the past. The global south, they are now emitting more to achieve some level of development. And this is where I would say we need to make adjustment to reach up to the net zero. Net zero, achieving a balance between the amount of greenhouse gases over the Earth's surface in the atmosphere, emission produced and the amount removed from the atmosphere, that is what the net zero is. It can be achieved through emission reduction. This is the first significant step. The industries, transportation, agricultural activity, other human activities, all of them, they are emitting greenhouse gases. But on the other side, emission reduction also involves adopting cleaner technology, improving energy efficiency, shifting to renewable energy sources. Another can be the carbon removal. The remaining emissions that cannot be eliminated are counterbalanced by removing an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This can be done through natural solutions like reforestation, soil management, carbon capture, etc. Another could be carbon offsetting. Nations invest in projects that reduce emissions, a way to offset their own emissions. This could again involve renewable energy projects, energy efficiency programs in other parts of the world also. Now the question is why it matters so much in the context of net zero. Achieving net zero is crucial for limiting the global warming. The target which has been set during the Paris Agreement. And to achieve net zero, the countries need to set targets, implement policies. There should be higher level of innovations and investment to the technology and infrastructure that enables sustainable practices. And also there should be mechanism for monitoring and reporting, tracking the progress, bringing out reports on emissions and offsetting activities, etc. So this is what the idea of net zero. And the way the human activities are being practiced over the Earth's surface, achieving the net zero target is a little difficult. I would bring in the discussion again the gap, the divide between global north and global south. Global north have achieved development. So they have scope of reaching net zero early. They also have technology. The global south, they have lesser resources, lesser level of technology, but they also want to achieve higher level of development. And this higher level of development with lesser technology, they are trying to achieve through fossil fuels. So their emission levels are higher. So in that context, the net zero requires more support from global north because their development is achieved from the higher emission levels in the past. They should support more the global south through technology, through money, through funds. But there is divergent view. And that is why the humanity is under threat. I'll stop here. Now you have fair idea that why net zero term is important and relevant to our discussion on climate change, and what are the possible solutions and how we are proceeding towards it. I'll stop here. Thanks for joining. Happy learning.